Hello everybody, SlimKirby here, and welcome to another Super 16 recap video. That's right, after giving it a go last year, I decided that it was only natural to do a follow-up, especially since I had a lot of things to say about last year's event. And to be honest, I think a lot of what I talked about was addressed and considered for this year's event, so maybe I won't be as ragey or complainy this time. Maybe. We'll just have to wait and see. Just as a refresher though, what is the Super 16? I'll link last year's video in the video description if you are interested and curious, and of course you can also find a link to my full run of this year's event if you want to see how it all went down in real time. But I'll briefly explain the concept again before we get started. This is an event held on the Twitch channel network Speed Gaming, a group known for hosting a number of speedrun related events and tournaments. Try to think of it as an ESPN network, but for playing video games fast. I've actually been in a number of broadcasts under Speed Gaming, though, through various commitments to the Link to the Past randomizer tournaments, and this is actually the 5th year I've personally done the Super 16 event. This is actually year number 8 for the event overall, so it's been going on for a bit, and significant progress has been made in going through the SNES library. But yeah, the main idea of this event is that 16 Super Nintendo games are chosen. Everyone who participates is given a goal for each game, and on race day we all attempt the endurance challenge of playing through all 16 goals and seeing how fast we can complete them. We're given the list 2 months before the race, so if you want to practice the games, you can definitely do so. But there are some people who try to race the games blind for the event on the day of the race. Although, I personally wouldn't recommend that unless you want to spend your entire day, if not longer, beating these challenges. Some of these can be pretty tricky, especially if you aren't familiar with speed tech or cheese strats. Still though, I will always give major credit and props to those who attempt that feat, and it's always pretty fun to cheer on those runners at the end when they are closing in on the finish line. It's a really great community and a morale-building experience. Compared to last year, I was actually pretty excited about this year's list. It helped that I had actually played more than just one game from the selections, which was the case last year as we all know. So I didn't really have to get my feet wet with too many new games, and even if any of those new ones gave me trouble, it gave me more time to focus on those games specifically and get more confident and acquainted with them, as opposed to balancing the entire list of newcomers all at once. I also felt that there weren't many games that jumped out at me for being incredibly difficult either. There were a few that looked awkward for sure, like, oh boy, this looks like it controls terribly, or, oh god, another fighting game, I suck at those. But even in those instances, the goals themselves didn't seem incredibly long or difficult, which was a major plus for me personally. So, in other words, I went into this list with some incredibly high hopes. How did those hopes endure this year's gauntlet though? Let's find out by covering the games and what we had to do for each one of them. The first game we had for this year's event was Super Bomberman 3 by Hudson Soft. And yay, it's a game I've Let's Played before. How about that? Given my experience with this game, in addition to the following 2 games of the series, isn't as extensive as the first 2. But that's only because I live in America and these games didn't come out to North American audiences because Hudson Soft's North American branch was shut down prior to this game's release. However, I love my Bomberman and I still managed to find ways to play this game despite that. The goal of this game in particular is to beat World 2 of the single-player campaign mode. This means you have to play through 4 levels of each world and also beat the boss of each world as well. Now, that doesn't seem to be too long of a goal, but trust me, it's not as short as you think. While some levels are just a simple screen, other levels have multiple screens, which means that for World 1, you're technically beating 6 levels, and World 2, you're beating 8. Sure, it's not a whole lot more, but trust me, that time can definitely add up, especially during a speedrun. The objective of each stage is to destroy all the energy towers in each of the screens. Once you do, the crystal orb will break, allowing you to obtain a picture fragment and end each stage properly. If there is no crystal orb, then the energy towers will just open a door or gate and allow you to access the next part of the level. As Bomberman, your main choice of weapons are your own bombs. You can lay bombs to destroy blocks, enemies, and the towers themselves. Be careful though, because these bombs are not only dangerous to your foes, but also to yourself as well, so be sure to stay clear of the blast radius, and most importantly, avoid trapping yourself. While you are working your way through each level, you'll find power-ups that will either increase the amount of bombs you can lay at one time, or even increase the distance of the bomb's firepower. Beyond that though, you can also find more unique power-ups that have more special effects, like the ability to kick bombs, the ability to walk through walls, or perhaps my favorite, the ability to convert your explosives to remote-controlled bombs, allowing you to detonate them whenever you're ready for them to go off. A must-have whenever it's available, since it's really good against bosses. Speaking of which, once you complete all the levels, you then have to take out one of the dastardly bombers who pilot a robot that you have to combat with. Each boss has a unique set of attacks and abilities that you have to watch out for though, so be prepared for a big battle. New to Super Bomberman 3 though are the introduction of the Louis, a furry kangaroo-like creature that Bomberman can ride around on. These guys give Bomberman an extra hit, and depending on the color of Louis, a special ability as well. These colors are completely random though, and you won't know which one is which until you make contact with the egg and jump on it yourself. Safe to say, some Louis are more helpful than others, and getting the right one could speed up your time tremendously, and trust me, I mean that too. The main colors you want to find are the pink and blue ones. Pink allows you to hop over a single space of the stage, assuming the following square is completely empty of course, and blue gives you the ability to punch bombs across the stage, much like the punching power-up in the first Bomberman game. Being able to access different parts of the stage sooner than you would be otherwise can be such a huge time save. In fact, the very last level before the boss of World 2 has a raised platform that you can access with the pink Louis at the very beginning of the level, and you can pretty much use that as a vantage point to access the rest of the level without having to explode too many of the blastable walls. Doing this allows you to save, and I'm not joking, at least an entire minute of time if you have this Louis, if not more. It's that slow otherwise. The other Louis just don't really do it for me. If I get the brown Louis, I might keep it as a last resort since it can be used for quick deconstruction and maybe a slightly faster boss kill, but the green and yellow ones are just not worth it. So, as you can probably see, there is a bit of RNG involved in this run. Actually, that's not true. There's a lot of RNG involved here. You see, it's not just the Louis colors that are randomized, the position of the bombable blocks, what blocks have power-ups, the random nature of the enemies in general. I'm not joking when I say this. As much as I love Bomberman, speedrunning these games can be a bit of a pain. Plus, if you take a death, you lose every power-up you currently have, with exception to your bomb capacity and firepower upgrades. So if you are fully decked out with all your favorite goodies, one wrong move or unfortunate circumstance can put you behind quite a bit, as you're not only losing the time starting over the level, but also potentially the ability to do the stage faster. And in this particular challenge, you're probably not going to see those abilities again, as they may only appear once in the first two worlds anyway. There is a bit of consistency, as you will always find the same power-ups in each level and segment, they just won't always be in the same blocks that you found them the first time. However, once you move on from those levels, yeah, try not to lose them. And if the RNG wasn't bad enough, I can't forget about the boss of World 1. This guy is annoying. His robot is a very cute fox robot that throws leaves at you, and any leaves that make contact with you will turn you into a furry creature that can only move and is not able to lay bombs for a few seconds. Time you could be using to attack, but to make this maneuver even worse, any leaves that make contact with your bombs will also turn them into useless power-ups that won't actually help you. And since he always throws them in straight lines, if you have a bomb waiting to explode, it's not going to meet its mark. And I swear, this fox always responds with his attack if you lay a bomb in front of him. Most likely, you're going to get your hits in when the fox turns into a purple flame and moves around trying to go after you. During this, he is completely vulnerable, so do your best to make sure you get your explosions in before he animalizes. Just be careful, because in this form he will automatically set off bombs on contact, so make sure you're not in range of your own explosives when he's on the move. Otherwise, you're gonna need to be clever with the timing of your detonations by laying a bomb out of the way early and then setting a bomb in front of him so the first bomb explodes the second bomb before he can complete his leaf attack. The second boss is much less annoying, and you will likely have, or at least should have, remote bombs by this point, so try to get into a pattern of laying a bomb and setting it off just as soon as you get out of its range, and it should go down very quickly. Just watch out for its other attacks, especially when it charges you. You can really tailor this goal around whatever your own personal style is. If you feel confident in your current bomb and firepower loadout, you can spend less time farming power-ups and focus more on just fast level completion. However, I would recommend picking up the heart power-up in the first part of 1-4 and the remote bombs in the third part of 2-3. Also, you can find 2 Louie eggs in 1-1, 1 in the first part of 1-3, 1 in the second part of 1-4, 1 in 2-1, 1 in the second part of 2-2, and 1 in the first part of 2-4. Just to know when to look out for one if you still want to risk switching it out or just need another Louie in general. Trust me, it may actually be worth to switch out for a fast 2-4 if you have that opportunity to. Another thing worth considering is playing as player 2 instead of player 1. Basically, if you start the system with only a second controller plugged into the player 2 slot and nothing in player 1's, you will start as the black-colored Bomberman instead of the standard white color. This Bomberman has a different starting location in each level, and in some cases he'll be located closer to the action, allowing you to get working on your stage objectives a bit faster. On average, I did find playing as black faster than white, although it might be a little more dangerous as well, since he will be closer to enemies, so keep that in mind. Overall, I like this game because it's a Bomberman game, but in terms of going fast in a speedrun sense, this admittedly can be a rough one to grind out just because of how much RNG is involved, and I also really hated how long the boss intros took, especially considering if you take a death, you have to watch them all over again. I do think the goal selected for this challenge was fine though. I think 1 world would have been too short, and doing 3 would have definitely been pushing it. Probably the best showing of Bomberman in these Super 16 events so far, at least in my opinion. I just don't think they make the best speed games due to that pesky RNG. The second game we have here is Killer Instinct by Rareware, and damn it do I hate fighting games. Now, I'll level with the organizers here. You can't expect to do an SNES marathon without some form of a fighting game. These games were super popular on the system back in the 90s. Heck, even Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter had a bit of a back-and-forth rivalry going on for fighting game superiority on the console, and that's just not something you can take away from how influential this genre was on the system. I just really suck at fighting games. Need proof? In my very first Super 16 event, I spent over 40 minutes on the Street Fighter 2 challenge, when everyone else finished in under 10 minutes. I just had a really rough time with it, and I don't want to speak on it further. For this challenge, we only had to beat 3 fighters in the default difficulty for the standard 1-player mode. You could choose any character you want, and I ended up choosing Combo because I heard he was pretty good. He's the type of character who hits really hard, you just have to find a way to get in there to get those hits in. He's also known as what I think is called a charge character, where a lot of his move inputs involve him moving back and then forward again, almost like a charging rhinoceros of sorts. I used a lot of these moves to come in close, followed by standard jab combos, and to mix it up I tried doing jump attacks to move forward as well, once again followed by the basic jabs. Trying to mix up your moves is very important for this, because due to the way fighting games were programmed back in the day, the AI starts to learn your patterns and read your inputs after a while, and that can be absolutely frustrating, especially when they just randomly counter with a massive combo that you almost have no real way of even predicting or blocking. Sometimes it feels like a match can go from looking good to looking bleak in a matter of 3 seconds if you aren't careful, and that kind of mentality can be very discouraging for me. What makes Killer Instinct different from other fighting games of the time is that it really focused hard on the comboing system. Every character has great combo potential, and in addition to their own moves, they also have combo breakers as well, and those are good to learn how to do and pull off, because if you do manage to get caught in those Fists of Fury, you have something you can retaliate with to potentially not only get out of a lethal combo strike, but also do some extra damage as well. Like all fighting games though, pulling off everything is very quick input dependent, and I swear every time I look at instructions and move lists for these fighting games, I always feel like I'd have a better shot at learning advanced level calculus than I would at understanding these fighting game controls. It's like it speaks a completely different language to me, or like it's some massive conspiracy theory where I'm the only one who's not allowed to learn how the game works while everyone else understands it perfectly. Kind of like that one scene from Always Sunny with the conspiracy theory board. You know the meme I'm talking about. Thankfully, though, the goal itself, beyond just the normal struggle of learning how to competently play a fighting game, is very short and not too hard. Heck, during one of my first few runs, I pulled off a 3-minute time just by button mashing, or at least that's what it felt like anyway. Plus, you have infinite continues, so it's just a matter of pushing and pushing until you finally get that run you need to move on. Because I don't enjoy fighting games, this was easily a low point for me, but at least it was a short low point. I honestly don't have much more to say than that. The order of opponents is random, so you don't really know who you're going to get to fight against, and even if there was some manipulation for that, I didn't personally think it was necessary to figure out for this run, as no matter what, I'm sure they would at least been struggling regardless. So yeah, that's pretty much Killer Instinct. On to game number 3, we have Phantom 2040, developed by Viacom New Media, a game based on the Phantom 2040 animated series. And I'll be honest, I know absolutely nothing about this series, so you are not going to get any sort of synopsis from me, just being real with you on that. As for the game itself, I don't really even know how to describe it in terms of genre. The best I got is an action-adventure game with some Metroidvania elements. And hey, I like Metroidvanias, so maybe this won't be so bad. The goal for this game was to beat Chapter 2, and, well, okay, this was probably the biggest hurdle in playing this game, because let's just say the game wasn't entirely clear on what the objective meant, or even how you're supposed to get there. You kind of have to just wander around until you find a boss to beat or an item to collect, and then use that item to access a different area and repeat the process again until you make progress. Maybe the game cutscenes and story could give you a better indication of what to do, but since we have to skip those in the name of going fast, I honestly couldn't say for sure. I will say though, in the little research I did for this game, it is actually pretty impressive how ambitious this game tries to be, in terms of the world building, the inventory system, and the fact that pretty much every mission, or chapter in this case, has alternate routes that can get you to your goal in a different way. Heck, when looking at walkthroughs or FAQs of this game, there were some things that I didn't even have to do or touch for this particular challenge. And I think that's pretty cool that a game that came out in the 90s had that amount of depth, as that's something I tend to see in more modern instances of this particular genre. I'll try to break down the general progression as best as I can, but try to understand that due to the nature of the Super 16, I will be super brief and concise, with very limited context. We start by going through University, taking out the Bayat hypercruiser, and obtaining an item that will allow us to get access to the warehouse. We then go to the warehouse, get through the area, and take out Graft and his giant mech walker. This will send us to the docks, where we ride a boat into the industrial area, where we will find Tracker. We chase him through the construction site, into a convoy of flying ships, where we fight him and complete Chapter 1. We then start Chapter 2, head to the ruins where we find an invisibility power-up that we can use to access the maximum building, and in that building we will once again fight Graft, where another defeat will put an end to Chapter 2, thus completing the challenge once and for all. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm sorry I can't go into much more additional detail, but that's just the way it's going to have to be for this particular summary. I don't know much about this series, and I did not want to spend too much extra time digesting this stuff when I personally don't even have plans to revisit this franchise or even this game further. It's nothing against the game or series, I just don't think I'm going to really have the time to devote to that, just being honest. However, with that being said, I do think this was actually a pretty cool game though, and once you know the path, the challenge itself is actually not too bad and kind of fun to do. We were allowed to make our starting number of lives default at 10, and thankfully when you die, you just have a brief couple of seconds you have to wait until you get right back up again, with full health and ammo energy too. So aside from the 5 seconds of stalling, there isn't much of a penalty for death, which I always appreciate. And as far as I could tell, the game does have passwords, so even if you game over, you can at least start back from the start of the chapter instead of the very beginning. Another thing I personally vibe with. As far as general speed strats though, the biggest one from what I could tell, aside from general memorization of stage layout and pathing, was the fact that you could equip your blaster gun to both the X and Y buttons, and this actually allows you to essentially double the output of your blaster, allowing you to really melt the bosses in this game. Just keep in mind that you will also lower your ammo faster as well, so be wary of that. Also, I couldn't figure out how to do this myself, but in the construction site there is an item that you can get that increases the range of your grappling rope. It's intended to use this extension to climb to the higher points of this level to chase the chapter boss, since the range of your initial grapple is much shorter, but apparently you can skip this? I clearly didn't do enough research on this because the rope isn't too far out of the way, but in the interest of going fast, it is definitely faster. Just wanted to point that out as well. But yeah, that's Phantom 2040, a nice foray into a series I've never touched before, with some generally positive results. Definitely the best game so far, despite some of its crypticness. Okay guys, brace yourselves, because we have a heavy hitter among us in this year in the form of Doom. That's right, one of the most influential and well-known first-person shooters of all time is making its way to the Super 16, and... oh shoot, that's right, it's the SNES version. This could be interesting. So yeah, much like fighting games, first-person shooters are another genre that I'm generally not crazy about. I do love my GoldenEye on the N64, but come on, that's like saying I know a kid who likes candy. Every kid likes candy, and everyone loves GoldenEye. Doom was initially developed by id Software, but this port of the game was handled by Sculptured Software, and, well, they tried. They really, really tried. Not to say the game is bad, per se, this is just not the version I would recommend playing if you're interested in the series, because translating a game like Doom to not only the SNES graphically, but also with the use of the SNES controller, a controller with only a D-pad for movement options, let's just say there had to be sacrifices, and sacrifices aplenty. For this challenge, we had to beat all the missions of the first episode on the Too Young to Die difficulty setting, basically the easiest setting in the game, thank God. Each level has you going around looking for the general exit, shooting enemies and monsters in your path, and, as the case of a majority of the levels, finding the right keys that will get you to your goal faster, or at all. Some of these levels can feel like actual mazes, and the graphics don't exactly help either. During my first couple of runs, I spent roughly 85% of my time just trying to figure out where to go, and battling the game's controls and environmental interface definitely made it a struggle to say the least. Once I knew what I was up against though, and kind of knew the path in front of me, it was definitely the game that felt the most rewarding to watch my time go down on, starting with a time close to an hour, and then averaging around 15 minutes during my final practice sessions. As for the general breakdown, there are 7 levels to get through here. The first level is pretty straightforward and easy. Heck, it's pretty linear all things considered, so even an inexperienced player should be getting through this in less than 5 minutes. The second level introduces our first usage of keys, but thankfully we only have one, and it's once again a pretty linear path once you get the key anyway. Level 3 is pretty much the same, but it does have a section with a very thin walkway surrounded by acid. And I always found this level memorable because if you go in the middle of the room into the acid, you can press a button that will raise the middle part of the room upwards, allowing you a much safer platform to walk on. Definitely more recommended than trying to navigate the thin area with a D-pad, that's for sure. Level 4 was actually a bit harder to manage, as this is the first area I would consider to be maze-like. There is a skip that allows you to circumnavigate a lot of this area, including skipping one whole key you have to find, but I couldn't quite figure out how to do it, so I just did it normally, probably losing about a whole minute of time in the process. Level 5 is a little more like levels 2 and 3 again, not being super maze-like, but pretty much forcing you to go one side of the level to get a key to get to the other side to hit a button, and then going back to the middle part to finish the level. Level 6 was definitely the longest level in this challenge though. There are 3 keys you have to pick up, and each subsequent key lies behind the previous door you had to open. So no matter what, you have to do a lot of back and forth in this level. This is definitely the level you're going to want to memorize if you want to have a good time, just due to the general nature of it, and the fact that I don't even think it has a skip associated with it either. And finally, we have level 7, the last level of the episode, and definitely the shortest in theory, as it's really just a boss fight against 2 beefed up enemies. Once you defeat them, the exit opens up and you can finish the challenge. Now, if this felt like any other first-person shooter that wasn't on the SNES, this would probably be a walk in the park, a spring breeze, if you will. But no, doing this on the SNES was definitely an adjustment. The game runs badly, the game looks bad, the game controls badly. It's just not good. With that being said though, playing on the easiest difficulty setting really helps this challenge a lot. There was honestly really only one part of the entire challenge where I felt like I was in fear of dying, and that was during the boss of the final level, and that's easily mitigatable if you get the rocket launcher anyway. Also, absolutely forget about aiming any of your shots in this game. And no, I'm not even saying that because the movement is atrocious or anything. I swear, it feels like your shots actually do manage to home in on the nearest enemy when firing. So long as something is in front of you, it'll go down if you fire at it. I don't know if it's just a quirk of the easiest difficulty or the SNES version in general, but it was nice knowing that I didn't have to worry about aiming here, because, again, moving around is really, really bad here. Like I said before, the boss can be kind of scary as there are two enemies. They take a lot of hits and can hurt you real bad if they get close. But if you pick up the rocket launcher in level 6, or the more convenient hidden one in level 5, you can actually take down both enemies in 3 hits, and you get 7 rockets, so even a bit of leeway if you somehow miss your mark on a few of your fires. I'll be real with you guys, as bad as this port was, I actually kind of liked this challenge, no joke. Now, I'll stand by my previous declarations, this game was ass to control, and I swear it was so frustrating to get stuck on a wall or corner because of the game's abysmal collision detection. Aside from that though, I didn't actually mind playing this, and has actually got me interested in playing more of this game. Not on the SNES though, that's for sure. I'm sure Shadow Mario 41 is out there grinning like the Grinch because of me saying that. After all, he's Rhode Island's #1 Doom fanboy. But hey, I recognize and respect potential, and I think this game set a pretty good standard for the genre. That standard just doesn't mesh well with on the SNES's hardware, that's for sure. Game number 5 is the one and only
Kirby's Avalanche.
And yes, the Super 16 gods are really smiling upon me this year, as this is back-to-back Kirby and Super 16 events, and I couldn't be happier about it. Kirby Superstar for Super 16 number 9, maybe? We'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, Kirby's Avalanche was developed by Compile, and of course published by Nintendo. And if you know your puzzle games, yep, it's Puyo Puyo, or Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine if you had a Sega Genesis growing up. Anyway, I like Puyo Puyo. It's no Tetris or Dr. Mario, probably my specialty when it comes to puzzle games, but growing up with this title did at least give me some Puyo Puyo experience. The goal for this challenge is to beat Stage 5 of the normal competition difficulty mode, while having the stipulation that you could put the CPU AI on easy. I know that might seem kind of confusing, but if you play easy from the competition menu, you'll basically be doing a 3-stage training mode, which won't count for the challenge, as normal starts the main campaign with different opponents. So in other words, you need to beat Poppy Bros Sr., Wispy Woods, Kaboo, Broom Hatter, and Squishy. The idea of Puyo Puyo is pretty simple. Colored blobs will drop down onto the puzzle screen, and you can clear the blobs by connecting 4 or more of the same color. Whoever fills up the screen, or to be more specific, the third column, will lose, so you essentially have to outlast your opponent. If you clear multiple blobs sequentially with one move and a nice combo, you'll send garbage blobs over to your opponent, and the amount you send will vary on how strong your combo was, meaning you can KO the enemy pretty fast if you know how to set up and execute combos fairly easily and quickly. There honestly isn't really much to say beyond that though. Basically, practice setting up combos and do what you can to recognize patterns and execute maneuvers when you see any opportunity to. That's really the key to going fast here. I wouldn't say any of the AIs you face off against really vary much in difficulty though. Heck, if anything, I feel like this challenge went on one level longer. Lololo and Lalala could have created some headaches and frustrations, but thankfully the goal is just before this gruesome twosome, at least in terms of their AI anyway. My general strategy for going fast here was basically using the stack 3 method, where I basically had 3 or 4 columns of colored blobs stacked next to each other, with a single blob of the color adjacent on top, pretty much allowing me, once I was ready, to clear the far stack and set up a decent 4 combo chain, which would roughly fill up half of my opponent's board with garbage. From there, assuming I do get the combo off, I just do my best to set up smaller chains and try to knock them out before they can recover. At the core, even though it's a simple strategy, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a guarantee to pull off though. you never know what moves the AI will pull off in the meantime, while you're trying your best to set up your combo, and more than that, the biggest RNG dependent factor, getting the right colored blobs you need to even make your combo work in the first place. There's so much luck that goes into this that grinding a good time for this is actually fairly difficult. The challenge itself is pretty short though. Next to Killer Instinct, this was my shortest run of the entire event in practice, and I owe a lot of that just to my familiarity with the game and Puyo Puyo in general. Plus, the fact that this was a short challenge made it actually fairly easy to practice as well, although I think I was personally more engaged with Warriors Woods and Bust-A-Move in previous Super 16 events. But that's only because I felt like I had a little more control over the luck elements of those games as opposed to this one, and they were in general newer and more fresh experiences since I didn't grow up with either of those two games. It was still a fun challenge for me though, especially now that we had a game that I was not only familiar with, but one I also considered part of my gaming expertise, since I tend to love puzzle games. So yeah, that was Kirby's Avalanche, another short and sweet puzzle game to continue the trend of the annual Super 16 puzzle entry.
Bronto Bird!
Game number 6 is a follow-up to a game I played in a previous Super 16 event. My first Super 16 event, actually, in the form of Super Turrican 2, developed by Factor 5 and published by Ocean Software. This game is another action-adventure game, kind of like Phantom 2040, but with more emphasis on the run-and-gun gameplay and no Metroidvania elements to speak of. The only thing I really remember about the first Super Turrican game from the first Super 16 event I did were all the glitches we had to perform to get through the stages pretty quickly. It was a lot of clipping through walls and spending as little time as possible doing any actual fun gameplay. For this challenge, there's honestly not a lot of that to speak of if I'm being frank. In fact, this challenge is just to beat the first world and then we're off to the next game, so another quick challenge in the books. See, I told you guys that they took my previous event's complaints to heart in terms of challenge length. Anyway, you control a heavily armed robot guy, or maybe it's an actual guy in a mech suit, I don't really know, I didn't really look into the lore for this game. But the objective is really just to get to the end of each stage and move on from there. Sometimes you have a boss to defeat, and other times you just have to leave the area. Your main means of combat is your blaster gun, which actually can be modified into various types of weapons based on the power-ups you collect. You have a spread shot, a flamethrower, a bouncing ball projectile that rebounds against the floors and walls, a laser gun. Those are all the main ones I remember anyway. But you can also use a grappling hook, much like the same grappling hook we had in Phantom 2040, and cling to walls and swing from the ceilings. You also have a screen nuke attack, which you can use assuming you have charges for it, and it's also great for dealing a lot of damage during those boss fights. And you can also turn into a rolling spiky ball, which I never really figured out the best way to control it properly, as it seemed pretty unruly, but many of the speedruns I watched used it for a slight speed boost, and being able to avoid some enemies, so definitely something I could see value in mastering if you are serious about speedrunning this game. But for me, I was clearly not as interested. This challenge, or world, was basically broken down into 5 separate stages, the last really just being the boss fight. The first stage is pretty self-explanatory, not really offering much of a challenge, and introducing you to the basic form of gameplay. It even has a nifty cars section where you can jump over bombs, and fire it and jump on flying robots, which was kind of fun actually. It also ends with a boss fight where you are basically just avoiding projectiles and firing at a giant wall tower. It's not too hard though, especially if you use one of your bomb nukes to kill it quickly. The second level is a bit more involved, as it forces you to make use of the grapple feature to climb walls, and even swing across some horizontal sections of the level as well. There's also a lot of tight and narrow passages that will force you to gun down a bunch of enemies, and it's definitely a good time to obtain the rebound blaster if you can find it. I found this level kind of irritating actually, just because of how many enemies there can be in those narrow hallways, and some enemies manage to hide behind pillars, making them invulnerable to shots for a little while. It just made those sections a slog to get through. And if you thought that was it, we also have another boss for this level too. This one is a little more difficult than the first one we fought, as it has quite a bit more health and takes up quite a bit of the screen. Definitely don't be afraid to use more of your smart bombs if you have them. The next 2 levels are actually quite a bit shorter. The third level especially, as it's pretty much forces you to run and climb through a lab, which is a rising acid that chases you. Don't be too afraid of this obstacle though, as if you keep moving, it shouldn't give you too much trouble. Although the level does have some surprise pit traps too, that can also catch you off guard if you're not careful. So make sure you're jumping quite a bit while making your way through here, just in case the floor starts crumbling below you. The fourth level is kind of an auto-scroller as you're hanging from the bottom of the ship while being assaulted by numerous flying robots. Depending on the gun you have, this section can either be really easy or really annoying. If your weapon isn't doing too well against the gliders, you can also try to maneuver yourself to get on top of the ship, as you'll have more control up there, but only do attempt this if you know you can reliably make the transition. Because if you fall off the level, you will lose a life, and you may find yourself needing to keep those, since if you lose all your lives, you get a game over, and you do have to start the entire game over again. At about the halfway point of this level, things will change quite a bit, and you'll land on a giant worm, and your goal here is to move from the left to the right, jumping off of each worm as it starts to sink into the bottom of the screen, and so you land on the next worm in the sequence. You repeat this like 10 times, and then you make your way to the end of the level. And finally, for the fifth level, we have the world boss fight, which is basically taking place in a worm's mouth, and you have to defeat its giant tongue thing. The worm will rotate in clockwise and counterclockwise fashions, and you have to jump onto all the solid ridges of the mouth without falling through and losing a life in the process. While doing this, you should be non-stop shooting at the tongue, and after a bunch of hits, it should go down, completing this level and the challenge itself. So yeah, that was Super Turrican 2. It was okay, I guess. Honestly, after playing Phantom 2040, this game was definitely a bit underwhelming, just due to the amount of stuff Phantom offered to begin with. This honestly felt pretty plain to me, and didn't offer anything super interesting and engaging. It just felt like more Super Turrican. The challenge itself is not very long, and I feel like even if you aren't super great at these types of games, it should still feel pretty manageable and beatable, since it's only the first world you have to complete anyway. I honestly can say that not much really stood out to me about this one though, which is a shame because it was a follow-up to a game I'd played previously for this event, but the game didn't really match what I had experienced before. Not that I thought the first game was amazing or groundbreaking or anything, but I actually enjoyed learning the skips for the levels, and at least felt the boss fights and the bit of gameplay we did have to do had something more interesting to offer the gameplay experience. Maybe this is an instance where maybe it would have benefited from being a bit longer of a challenge, but I honestly couldn't say for sure. I think that's all I'm going to say about this one though. Overall, it wasn't bad and is far from the worst game on this list, but it definitely had some issues of being memorable and engaging for me, and that's just my own honest opinion. Oh boy, here we go guys, on to game number 7, and perhaps what was my biggest kryptonite for the Super 16 events, The Mask by Black Pearl Software. Not only is this a licensed game, something that's honestly had pretty mixed results in the past, but this is also this year's only game where we had to actually beat the whole thing in order to complete this challenge. Yeah, that is something you have to do in this event from time to time, assuming the game is short enough anyway. And sure enough, this game is pretty short, but I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. This was also extremely rough for me as well. I did not have a lot of fun with this one, and I think you will very quickly see why just by watching the footage back here. Let's do the breakdown first though. Like I said, we have to complete the entire game for this challenge. That means we have to beat 7 levels and make it through all of them without losing all of our lives. Because if we do, it's a game over and back to the very beginning we go. The Mask is a side-scrolling action game where you basically just have to make it to the end of each stage, usually by making it through a maze of areas and rooms, and beating the boss at the very end, blocking the exits. You control Jim Carrey, the Mask, and you actually have a lot of tools and tricks at your disposal, from being able to attack with boxing gloves, a hammer, a tornado attack, a slide move, an AoE horn and gun attack, both of which are really powerful and you want to keep those for the boss fights as much as possible, and you also have the ability to run super fast by holding both the L and R buttons while moving. Most of these attacks and maneuvers, though, can only be used if you have enough mask energy, which is a number that is displayed at the bottom of the screen. And if you don't have enough energy to use that attack or move, you just won't do it unless you're able to obtain some more energy along the way. And in most cases, if you're already on the boss fight, you may be out of luck if you use too much of it early on, forcing you to either take a death and go back to your last checkpoint with more energy, or trying to beat the boss with very weak attacks, something that is honestly not recommended, especially considering how weak those attacks are and how much HP the bosses will have in general, especially towards the end of the game. It seems pretty standard, but there are some difficulties that arise from this. For one, it's fairly easy to run out of mask energy without realizing. The most powerful attacks will use a lot of it, and not only that, but even using the non-combative super jump, a maneuver you will likely be using for numerous platforming sections throughout the game, will also use mask energy as well, so beware of overindulging in those conveniences. Because of that, you're probably thinking, well, no big deal, I'll just run through the levels quickly as possible, and only use those things if I have to. Well, about that. The enemies in this game suck. It's already bad enough that the mask is kind of awkward to control, being very fast and slippery at times, but he also has literally 0 invincibility frames, so it's so easy to get comboed and interrupted while making your way through these levels. And sticking around to fight and beat every enemy just does not feel worth it, because your mask powers are the best ways to defeat enemies, but you really need those for the bosses, so it's kind of a pick your poison mentality. Also, I'm not joking when I say these guys will interrupt you to Kingdom Come, because they will. I especially noticed that when using air vents to warp to another part of the stage. They can seriously just attack you mid-animation when you're almost fully out of the room, just to knock you out of the animation and force you to go into the vent again, which just made those moments incredibly tedious and frustrating. Also, when you're in the boss fights, don't just unload your full payload of ammo on the boss lickety-splits. If the boss, or really just any enemy or damaging projectile, happens to make contact with you in the middle of your attack animation, you will not perform it, yet you will lose the mask energy. So, congratulations, you just possibly made your fight a whole lot harder and longer. Don't you feel good about that? Because I sure didn't whenever the hell that happened to me. You really have to get a feeling for this game and its mechanics if you want to get through this in a comfortable manner. And that's the thing, I never felt comfortable with this game. It just felt incredibly awkward and unforgiving, and I seriously just did not enjoy playing a single minute of this game. Even when I had successes and some decent runs, it was still easily one of the lowest points of this event, if not the absolute lowest. And I just wish this game could have been so much better than it actually was. I honestly don't really even feel like breaking down the stages too much either, because a large part of this game is really just the same process for every single level anyway. The first level is not too hard, but it is fairly easy to get lost because everything looks pretty samey. At least the mid-boss and boss go down in 2 and 3 hits from the gun attack respectively, so that's something. Level 2 is a bit more difficult, maybe a little easier to get around, but it does have a section where you can fall into a bottomless pit and die, and with slippery controls, that's never a fun prospect, so be very, very careful. Also, the boss for this stage also kind of sucks too. He's pretty fast and tends to get in your face a lot, so try to find a way to lure him into a corner and then unload with the gun attack when you have a little bit of distance from him. Level 3 is a lot like Level 2, but probably a bit easier since there is no way to auto-lose a life here. Some of the enemies can be irritating though, and not to mention some of the windows in the stage have an annoying quirk of opening while you're climbing a vertical section, causing you to get hit, take damage, and a little bit of knockback in the process. Seriously, the game controls oddly enough already. Do we really need an obstacle like this? The boss is also a little easier too, although it can damage you pretty heavily if you aren't careful. But if you come in with enough mask energy, you should be fine. Level 4 takes place at the park, and this is probably the smoothest level to get through normally. Not a lot of enemies, and the path forward is generally pretty obvious, although you do have to navigate a treetop maze at one point where you can barely see your character. Just keep feeling around though and follow the collectibles if you need to, just to find your way out of it. I also strangely had some issues with this level's boss too. It's not too tough, but you really need to make sure you get all of your gunshots off though, because if you miss one, you might be spending a lot of time punching and horning at the end to sap his remaining health away, and he tends to jump around a lot, so it can be hard to lock him down. Level 5 was probably my least favorite level of the entire challenge though, the prison cell. The enemies here are relentless. You have to flip switches to turn off electric gates, while also trying not to fall into small holes that will slow you down, sometimes while also trying to avoid those same enemies I mentioned before. It has another bottomless pit section, and the boss of this level is also very irritating, being incredibly huge in a very small arena, meaning if you don't stun lock him early, he will interrupt you constantly, and that is most certainly not fun. Level 6 is another incredibly difficult level where you have to use your horn attack at the very beginning of the stage to skip the level entirely. Wait, what? Did the developers really extend the horn's hitbox that much, where if it touches the exit plane it just ends the level? Apparently so. Well, I'm not complaining, as it means I have to play less of this game. The final level of this game is no slouch either. It's a pretty long level to navigate through, and then you have the final boss, which... yeah, it's the final boss for a reason, that's for sure. It has a lot of health, has some really devastating attacks, and can be an absolute pain to take down. It even has a screen nuke attack where he shouts, "Payback!" and it can even hit you if the guy isn't even on screen. It's an absolute pain in the ass, and not fun to take down. However, there is some cheese to this fight, which I easily took advantage of. For one, if you use a super dash slide attack, you can push him out of the room into the previous area, which means he has to walk back into the arena to keep fighting you. And conveniently, this boss fight has a way you can replenish not only your health, but also your mask energy, so you can slide into him, knock him away, stock up on stuff for a few seconds, knock him back again, and repeat the process until you're maxed out. And at that point, just spam the gun attack as it does the most damage, and eventually you'll beat him. It's a slow process, but the safety is definitely worth it. Once you beat this guy, congratulations, you have beaten the worst game of this Super 16 event. At least, in my opinion. My god, this game was terrible. And like, I can't even blame the fact that it's a licensed game. The SNES had a lot of great licensed games. Even games like The Lion King, a licensed movie game that is generally considered pretty difficult, at least felt like a fair challenge to me. This just felt really bad and awkward to play, and I didn't have fun with it, even when I had a good run. I will give a small thank you to YouTube user TravVictox for providing a tutorial for getting through this game fast, although not so much the going fast part, but more so for just helping me understand the mechanics a bit more. I just could not play this fast by any means, and took a much safer approach when learning and playing this. One thing that did help me get through this, though, was thankfully a furry little friend named Milo. Basically, every stage in this game has a dog named Milo, which I'm guessing is the dog from the movie, and every time you find and collect him, he'll increase your max health and mask energy by 50. So if you want more survivability and more usage of your mask powers, it is imperative that you pick the little guy up as much as you can. The gun attack requires 100 mask points, so even just getting 4 Milos throughout the run is 2 additional strikes of that attack, so very useful if you're struggling with this game. But yeah, to likely no one's surprise, this was easily the lowest point of the list so far for me. I do think the game was pretty ambitious and clever with what it tried to do, but it just needed way more time to cook. The general control of the character needed a major fix. Enemies needed to have much less priority, and the mask powers needed to be heavily more balanced in terms of their cost. Spending 100 energy for one attack that could easily fail due to an enemy just barely clipping your hitbox was a major frustration I personally could have done without. If those things were focused on a little harder, I think this could have been a much better game. But it is what it is. Let's move on to the next one, though. Also, hey, post-commentary SlimKirby here. Just to let you guys know that on the day of the race, since I kind of wrote this script a little bit before the race actually happened, there was actually an infinite lives code that was found that can be used during the events. And even though I didn't utilize this since I had trained so much without using it, I didn't need to use it, but it was a good thing that we found that. I think it would have made this game a whole lot better to play through. In theory, I still think the game sucks. I still think it was a bad game to play, and I don't want to play it again. But hey, did want to at least highlight that that was found literally a couple of hours before the race actually started. So, again, felt like mentioning that before we moved on. But yeah, let's keep going. And for game number 8, I'm hoping for something a bit less stressful and less intense. You know, just as a breather of sorts. So let's take a look at what we have next, and Mega Man 7? Oh god, that's not a breather game at all. Oh well, Super 16 gonna Super 16. So yeah, Mega Man 7, developed and published by Capcom, and a continuation of the classic Mega Man series that made a name for itself on the NES, but now it's on the Super NES. How will this series fare now that it's on a new console? Well, thankfully Capcom at least kinda got a head start on here with the Mega Man X games, so surely we got something good here. I know this title is not generally looked at with the same highs as the NES games, but I will give this game credit for at least mostly getting it right. The larger sprites and hitboxes might take some getting used to, but really I think the worst part of this game is honestly just the final boss fight, and since this is the Super 16, I really don't think we'll be going that far anyway. Speaking of which, what is our goal this time? Both Mega Man X games we've done so far have had us taking out every single Maverick available to us at the very beginning. And trust me, while I do admit that both Mega Man X2 and X1 are fantastic games, even I felt those challenges went a bit too far in the length department. Thankfully though, I think the organizers took that critique to heart this time, because we only have to defeat half the Robot Masters here, and the mid-game boss fights that follow after the first 4. So roughly this should be half as long as those previous challenges were, in theory. The challenge starts with the introduction stage, where you will likely be spending more time waiting for dialogue to scroll by than actually playing the game. More on that point later. Once you complete the stage, you get the option of 4 Robot Masters to take on: Freeze Man, Junk Man, Burst Man, and Cloud Man. The weakness order of this grouping is Freeze beats Burst, Burst beats Cloud, Cloud beats Junk, and Junk, by that logic, beats Freeze. So really, the big decision you need to make here is which Robot Master you start with. I personally went with Burst Man because I felt like he was the easiest robot to take down with just the normal Buster weapon. Also, the stage itself isn't that hard and comes with a few easy to get safeties as well. After that, I went to Cloud Man stage to take him out, and then Junk Man stage following that. While in the Junk Heap, I also switched on the power of the elevator room using Cloud Man's weapon, which allowed me to collect the Rush Jet adapter as well. This actually made one of the rooms in this level a lot faster, and I felt like the extra time getting it was worth not waiting around as long. Finally, after Junk Man went down, I took on Freeze Man, eliminating him from the picture, and then took a trip to the Robot Museum, where I fought an insane clown robot left behind by Dr. Wily. Although this boss can be annoying to fight, it goes down pretty easily to Burst Man's weapon, and heck, even Cloud Man's weapon too. So if you use these powers effectively, you should have no problems with this boss, especially if you manage to pick up some E-Tanks as well, just in case you get low on health. Once he goes down, that's pretty much the end of this challenge. I will say, as the closing game to the first half of this list, I think this was a good choice and a good goal to aim for. Essentially only doing half of the main 8 stages definitely eliminated the bloat that I felt from the Mega Man X challenges in the past. Plus, since this game only offers 4 stages at the beginning, you still get the sense of picking a unique order that works for you, specifically when taking out the stages and the bosses involved. I started with Burst Man, but I know that some people opted to pick Cloud Man first. Heck, even in my Let's Play of Mega Man 7, I picked Freeze Man first, so it really shows that anything could be viable here. Also, despite being part of the Mega Man Classic series, I will say that the difficulty definitely feels toned down a bit. And again, I'm not saying that as a bad thing by any means. They were obviously bringing in an engine that saw no major changes or updates for the last 6 installments into a whole new environment with different sprites and more available technology, so it was never going to feel one-to-one, let's be real. But if you've played a Mega Man game before, or heck, even the X series, you should feel right at home here. Honestly, the only thing that really gave me grief with this challenge was the unskippable dialogue featured in the introduction stage, in between stages, and the conversation between Mega Man and Dr. Light before facing the boss of the museum. You cannot skip this text for some reason, and the amount of waiting you have to do is excruciating. In fact, you have to wait 2 minutes before you get to any actual gameplay here. Not even the RPG for this year's list has that amount of waiting involved, and that's saying something. I honestly would have practiced this game a lot more if it wasn't for this unskippable text, because I honestly had a lot of fun with the actual gameplay for this one. Say what you want about Mega Man's difficulty, when you get that feeling of starting to master it, or at the very least a really tough section of the game, it can feel very rewarding, and this challenge definitely had moments of that. It was a fun ride and a good way to wrap up the first half of this year's Super 16 event. Okay, moving on to game number 9, will we finally get our breather game? No, we will not, because it's time for Toy Story, developed by Psygnosis and Traveler's Tale, and published by Disney Interactive and Nintendo, of course. Yeah, you got a friend in me, to infinity and beyond, there's a snake in my boots. Yeah, I think many of us are familiar with Toy Story. And considering how popular this movie was when it first debuted at the box office, it's really no surprise that a licensed video game wasn't far behind. But how did this game turn out, especially when considering our earlier movie game experience with The Mask? I guess we'll just have to find out. Our goal for this challenge was to beat the level called Buzz Battle, a boss fight that takes place as the 8th stage of the game. So 8 levels must be beaten for this goal, each with its own obstacles, challenges, and sometimes even gimmicks and control options as well. The first level of the game is very simple. There are very few enemies to avoid and even fewer objectives to complete. You have to free the army men from their tub on top of a dresser, knock a walkie-talkie down from a high place to give to the army men, and then wait at the location of the other walkie-talkie to complete the level. This level is streamlined so much though that you don't even have to wait for the army men to grab the walkie-talkie. As long as you knock it down and free the green soldiers in the process, you pretty much complete the mission once you reach the ending platform. The second stage is actually a timed level, where you need to get all the toys back to their original location before Andy comes upstairs, requiring you to not only free all of your friends from the blockades they are stuck behind, but also inflate a balloon to knock them back in the toy chest. Finally, after getting those guys taken care of, you need to free Rocky as well, who not only needs to find his place under the bed, but also lift up an impediment that's blocking the RC car from also getting under the bed as well. It's actually recommended to do this first and then worry about the toy chest toys while waiting around for Rocky to do his thing, just because it does take a while. Finally, once all the toys are taken care of, Woody must take his rightful place on the bed before he's ultimately replaced by the coolest toy of them all, Buzz Lightyear. And yeah, Buzz is quite the toy alright. The next stage even proves that point too, as Buzz challenges Woody to a race around the room. You can't actually win this race, it's mainly just trying to keep up with Buzz as he flexes across the stage, making his bout practically seem effortless. This stage is actually pretty tricky though. You have to do a lot of platforming and also avoid getting hit by several enemies in the process. And since I'm incredibly impatient when it comes to stuff like this, safe to say there were a lot of moments with this one that gave me a lot of grief, just because I kept taking damage and in some cases even started losing my 1-ups as well. Definitely not something you want to indulge in for a challenge of this nature. More on that later. You also need to use Woody's voice box string to swing across hooks in the room as well, otherwise you'll fall into the abyss below and lose some health in the process. Although, funnily enough, you can use this non-instant death nature of these pits to skip quite a bit of this room, as you don't die or respawn back to the last platform you touched, rather just bounce up and forward until you find a place to land. It's dangerous because you can lose a lot of health this way, but you can skip a bit of the waiting around and climbing, which saves some time in the process. The fourth stage is actually a mini-boss fight with Buzz, and no, this is not the battle we need to do to complete this challenge. This is Nightmare Buzz, where all you have to do is knock away his yellow orbs, and then attack him a few times. Just be careful, because you don't want to be in the way when his laser goes off. Stage 5 will probably give every person who's played this game as a kid PTSD, because we have the dreaded RC car level. I remember this being a huge wall for people growing up, but honestly, I thought it was actually fairly free. The controls are not great, but if you played RC Pro-Am, they're kinda like that. Anyway, after Woody performs an act of vehicular toy slaughter, the next 2 levels turn Andy's room into an absolute hellscape as Woody tries to escape the toy's dreaded revenge. Rex is kind of on your side though, so you spend level 6 trying to free him from blockades, and then level 7 has you riding him as an auto-scroller, where you must jump over the other toys. It's kind of like the ostrich riding from Lion King, except not as punishing. Finally, after making it all the way here, it's time for the actual Buzz battle, where you have to stop Buzz's onslaught as the two toys duke it out under Andy's car. Or his mother's car, anyway. The objective here is not to attack Buzz, but rather knock around a tire so it traps Buzz, and you have to do this 4 times before you get knocked out yourself. This fight is not too hard, in theory. Honestly, running under Buzz during his Infinity and Beyond attack can be kinda scary, because Woody's hitbox is really not that far from Buzz's at his highest point, so running under him can feel really tight. This battle alone scared me quite a bit for reasons I'll go over shortly, but thankfully this is the final hurdle. Once you take down Buzz, you have completed the challenge and game number 9. So how does Toy Story stack up to the other challenges so far? Well, it's not the mask level of difficulty, I'll say that much, and at least for me, it's not a fighting game either, but this was honestly a tricky spot for me. It may not seem like it in the footage I'm showing, but this game can actually be pretty hard and unforgiving at times. Taking damage is really easy to do, sometimes enemies can come out of nowhere and clip you without even realizing, and Woody's hitbox is incredibly large as well, and there aren't a lot of health refills either. Also, if you think you can just sprint through some of the stages and just tank hits when you are at the end of a level, funny thing about that, you actually keep that amount of health for the next stage too. Heck, even if you finish Nightmare Buzz on level 4 with 1 health, when you come back to normal Woody gameplay after the RC car of level 5, you'll still have that 1 health on level 6. So mitigating damage here is absolutely crucial if you want that breathing room. Why am I being so critical on keeping you alive in this game? Well, here's the thing. If you get a game over, you are starting back from the very beginning. And no, I am not joking when I say that. Don't you just love retro game difficulty? What makes this worse is the fact that for some reason, despite all the other versions of this game having this feature, the American SNES version is the only version that doesn't have a password system. I don't know why the hell this feature was excluded, especially after the Japan Super Mario Bros. 2 debacle, but here we are, and thankfully, the Super 16 organizers were kind enough to allow us to use the Japanese version of the game to make use of the password feature. Although, I don't think there were passwords for every level, just a couple of them, so you'd have to start back at the RC car level if you completely game overed in level 6, 7, or 8. Still though, very appreciated that we had this safety. So yeah, that minor quirk was definitely a huge shortcoming for this game, but by the time I learned the game and all of its intricacies, I guess it wasn't that bad. I enjoyed this way more than the mask, that's for sure. Still probably on the lower end of this list though, but I give it props for being quite ambitious with its various gameplay styles and level gimmicks. Also, I think it does a pretty decent job of mirroring the movie. The Nightmare Buzz level is kind of out of nowhere, and the Woody and Rex team up is a little random, I guess, but it was a way to fill in some narrative gaps that would have been harder to do in video game form. It wasn't a great game, but it's passable when you figure out what you're doing. On to game number 10, we're going from one motion picture to another one, as we have Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie, the game, or rather the game based on the movie, something like that. Anyway, this game was developed by Natsume and published by Bandai, and this is actually the second Power Rangers game done for the Super 16. We did another one 2 years ago, and that one was okay. Not bad, but not spectacular either. A pretty standard beat 'em up, and this one is looking to be about the same. Albeit, I did find this one slightly more challenging, but also a little more interesting too. The goal for this challenge is to beat Stage 2, so once again, we really don't have to go too far into this game to beat this challenge, so it should be easy enough. There's not really much to say about the progression in this one though. You just move from left to right, defeat enemies as you move forward or whenever it forces you to, go through each stage transition, and ultimately reach the boss, where you take it down to complete a stage. It's really that simple. The combat is relatively simple too. You have a basic punch and kick combo, a jump and jump attack, and the ability to switch lanes via the L and R buttons, something you will have to do in certain places if you get blocked by a wall or need to avoid an AoE attack on your current side. As you defeat enemies and collect their drop power charges, you'll fill up a meter where once it's completely full, it's Morphin time, and you can turn into one of the Power Rangers. You are much stronger morphed, and if you build up your meter again in this form, you'll get a weapon for a brief period of time, that has more range and does even more damage. Plus you also get a screen nuke attack as well, which is very important for knocking down the bosses and tough enemies very quickly. The bosses themselves are really not too bad. The first one has pretty telegraphed attacks, and while the second boss is a little slower, since its main hitbox is only accessible via riding a platform and jumping, it's really not too hard to stay out of firing range. Plus again, this is a great boss to use screen nuke on, so try to take advantage of that if you can. This challenge was actually pretty easy. I was a little worried at first because in my first runs, I kept losing all of my lives at the end of stage 2, and although you can continue from the stage you left off at, you do have to start at the very beginning of that stage, which is quite the trek back. So you have to really make sure you don't take too much unnecessary damage, something that was a little difficult to manage with stage 2 personally. However, once I got more familiar with the game, it really wasn't that bad. It's definitely really important to know the best times to utilize your screen nuke though, and as I said before, the best time is definitely during the end level boss fights, and the mid-boss of stage 1. However, keep in mind that it's not just saving those nukes for those moments in particular, but also when you obtain the nukes to begin with, since you only get the attack when you max out your meter a second time. If you max it out too early, the meter may deplete before you even get to the boss in question, and that's pretty much a time sink. Because of this, once I learned the layout of the stages, I purposefully held off in collecting power charges if I was close to max, but not quite at the boss yet, and made sure I maxed it out right before, just so I had it ready for when the fight started. Plus, for end-level bosses, this gave me a chance to utilize the stronger ranged weapon as well, for a little bit until I was ready to make everything explode. I suppose you could also hold off on your initial Morphin time transformation as well, and only use it when your health is in danger, but the problem with this is that enemies will take a lot longer to go down in your human state. So in the interest of speed, it's probably best to morph at your first opportunity and convenience. I'll be honest, despite being a kid of that particular generation, I never really got into Power Rangers. I had nothing against the show, it just wasn't something I went out of my way to watch or keep up with. So sorry if I wasn't able to provide much context, information, or references, as you were all probably hoping for. In fact, the only reason why I chose Rocky the Red Ranger is just because that's the character the top runner of the Super 16 used, so I just assumed he was the best or something. Ultimately though, even though I'm not huge on Power Rangers, this wasn't a bad game to play. It's a pretty standard beat-em-up that doesn't feel as difficult as other beat-em-ups do at the time. Looking at you, Maximum Carnage. And the way it implements the morph state of the Power Rangers was kind of unique as well. I wasn't blown away by this game, but I didn't hate playing it either. It was just fine, really, and that's pretty much all I have to say about it. Okay, we probably got this about 2 or 3 games too late, but we finally have our breather game in the form of Battle Racers by Bon Presto. Game number 11. Now, you're likely asking me, what the hell is Battle Racers? Well, think Mario Kart, but more futuristic, as you race with robots and not mushroom people in carts. Also, this game is Japanese exclusive, that never came out in America, so another reason you've likely not heard of this. This is also the staple Super 16 racing game for this year, and these are generally pretty easy, so yeah, let's take a look and see what this game is all about and what it has to offer. The goal for this challenge is to finish the 3rd cup of the game, and no, you don't have to unlock the 3rd cup or play either of the previous 2 cups to do this either. You just need to play the 3rd one and complete it. And when I say complete, I mean you don't really even need to win the cup either. Just get through every race without ranking out or destroying your robot. Heck, in my practices, I don't think I ever even ranked out either, so this is honestly a very generous requirement. You have 6 races to get through, and I think that's the reason why they just focused on the 3rd cup, because the 1st and 2nd only had 4 and 5 races respectively, and they probably weren't too difficult or long, so it made the most sense to just jump up to Cup 3 if it was already available. But yeah, it's a pretty standard racing game with elements of Mario Kart. Well, okay, I feel like there are more than just Mario Kart elements here too. Even the general look and feel of the game and its HUD screams Mario Kart, almost like they borrowed a number of assets from the game as well. But hey, not like I blame them, Mario Kart was huge, even on this console. The racetracks themselves, though, were honestly nothing too extraordinary. The first track was a little awkward to drive on, especially if you're playing this game for the first time and don't really know what you're up against. Plus, the course has a really distracting fog element for some reason, which also made it a little strange. The second track was a lot less weird. It did have a lot of tight turns though, but using the L and R button to drift around these curves actually made this track very rewarding to drive optimally. Honestly, I think the drifting in this game feels better than both Mario Kart and F-Zero, strangely enough. Track number 3 was probably my least favorite track to drive on though. In addition to having some awkward tight turns, there were also a lot of random holes you could fall into, which basically made you stop for a few seconds. Really irritating. Plus, the random lighting effects were back, this time creating more darkness element, which again was more distracting than it was interesting. Track 4 actually felt pretty similar to Track 2, although it probably was a bit longer and with less walls around the areas where you could fall off. It also had kind of a Donut Plains vibe from Super Mario Kart, or maybe even the river and lakeside parks from Mario Kart Super Circuit. Tracks 5 and 6 were honestly both very easy considering they were the closing races for the Cup. Track 5 did have a section with some very quick back-to-back turns, but they didn't really feel too hard to manage all things considering. For the most part, the track still just kind of felt like a giant circle or square. And the final track seriously felt like the easiest and shortest track of the entire Grand Prix. It even had a little section where you could jump across a gap and save a few seconds over your opponents, who seemed to never take this shortcut for some reason. Pretty underwhelming track to end on, but I guess it gave us a nice victory lap of sorts for completing this challenge. But yeah, that's really about all there is for Battle Racers. It really was just a breather game, I guess. As far as general speed tech is concerned, just learning the tracks and the best way to take on each race is really the strategy here. There's probably some uber-level skips that I'm unaware of that only the true masters of Battle Racers could do, but it didn't seem like anyone else in the Super 16 crew did much differently here, aside from just racing normally like I did. As far as character choice, I personally stuck with the character that had the best handling and defense, just because I felt the game did control a bit awkwardly at first, and during my first runs of using the speed character, I actually blew up my car a number of times, so I needed someone with a bit more bulk and control, and I never really switched back or tried again once I got used to him. Oh, and there are also items in this game, much like in Mario Kart, but I'll be honest, I didn't really use them. If anything, it's kind of advisable not to use them, because some of them have an animation that stalls the race, and your movement for a second or two, and obviously you want your game to keep moving. Although, you technically can see what the items are on the map before you pick them up, and theoretically, you could go for the speed boost item, which does give your character a mushroom-like boost from Mario Kart, so I could see those being somewhat useful in a going fast setting, but nothing I really could get super consistently. Overall, this game was okay. I think I've enjoyed every other racing game we've done for Super 16 though, although I'm a little biased because one of those games was Uniracers, one of my favorite SNES games of all time. Still though, it was neat getting to try this game out though, and who knows, maybe I'll try out the other cups on my own time. I'm not sure if any advanced level difficulty is in the game though. After all, not like I can read Japanese anyway, but if this game does get as hard as Mario Kart AI can get, this could be a rough one to complete, honestly. I did like the drifting controls, but everything else felt kinda clunky and weird. And as mentioned before, some of the fog and lighting effects definitely came off as more distracting than anything. Also, for some reason, in certain tracks, the music just wouldn't play for some reason, meaning the only thing you could hear were the sound effects, and I swear, hearing the put sound of your robot while making every single turn got a little grating at times. Not the worst game of the list, but definitely a bit underwhelming, although I guess it did perform its purpose of being a breather game, I guess. For game number 12, we have Final Fight 3, another game developed and published by Capcom. It's also another beat-em-up, so hey, the Power Rangers got a little company this year for this particular genre. How about that? I personally don't know much about Final Fight or have that much experience with the series, but one thing I can say for certain is that Mike Haggar is an absolute unit and badass, and his powers should never be denied. Unfortunately for this run, I'll be using Guy, but only because he's faster, and that's kind of the point of the Super 16 in the first place. Sorry, Mike. The goal for this challenge is completing round 4, and the best way to summarize this goal is play the game through until you get the message saying round 4 clear. The reason I emphasize that is because this game actually has a pretty unique feature of having branching paths in its level structure, so much that you and another player could wind up having completely different stage 4s in this particular challenge. I do actually give the devs some props for this though, as this is something I would expect more in a modern game, but hey, I guess Final Fight 3 was a bit more ahead of its time, I guess. So yeah, in addition to moving fast, you theoretically also want to find the fastest route in terms of completing the 4 stages, and although there is still a pretty obvious route for this, it definitely added an extra layer to this challenge that I personally appreciated. You don't have to worry about any of this stuff for stage number 1 though. It's a very linear path, so just do your best to fight through the waves of enemies and then defeat the boss named Dave at the very end of the level. Stage 2 technically doesn't have an alternate route to a different stage either, but it does have a faster path to the end of the level, and you do that by knocking an enemy against a door in the background, causing your character to go inside a bar where you actually come face to face with the boss of the level a lot sooner. Once you take care of Better Coleman Solomon here, you have completed Stage 2 with only 2 more levels to go. Stage 3 is where the most important factor of the run comes into play. Very early into the level, you'll come across a bus stop sign in front of 2 glass windows. If you manage to throw an enemy into this sign, you'll destroy it, and it'll actually cause the buses to not stop at that location anymore. And since the bus is the only way to continue the level just kind of ends there. This not only makes level 3 very quick, but you also skip several more screens of enemy fights, including the boss of this area as well, a very annoying boss at that. And even more than that, you'll go to a different Stage 4, which is actually shorter than the other Stage 4, so you really don't want to miss this skip, because you'd be wasting a lot of time in the process. For Stage 4, it's more of the same. The enemies are a bit more bulky by this point, but at this juncture, you should know how to take care of them. By the end of the stage, you'll run into Drake, who, damn, if that's the same Drake from Advance Wars, he sure got jacked over time. Once you beat him though, you'll complete Stage 4, and also complete the challenge. Well done. I don't have a lot to say about this game. You can play Final Fight 3 as a very basic beat-em-up, where you can essentially just beat the whole game using your basic combo to win, and over time, while mashing, you'll probably be able to perform some other attacks and abilities as well, like throws and other special attacks. As I mentioned during Killer Instinct, I'm not one for learning or understanding input sequencing for special moves and abilities, so I couldn't really make the most of my character, but thankfully for this game, you don't really need to. In fact, for a majority of the enemies, you kind of want to dash attack into them, and then initiate your basic combo, not finish it, and then start another one so you can get a lot of quick hits in, and at the same time, prevent finishing your combo so the enemy doesn't get knocked down too early when they still got a bit of their health remaining. This way you can assure, in most cases, that when they do get knocked down, it'll be for the finishing blow, and not have to wait a second or two for them to get back up. That's pretty much the key for going fast in these kinds of games. I'm personally not the best at it, but I at the very least understand the concept. As for bosses, since they generally have a counter move, you kinda have to rely on more of a hit and run strategy with them, but it can vary on how you implement that since they all have different ways of retaliating. Honestly, even though I don't have much to say about this game, it was actually a pretty satisfying experience nonetheless. Even though the goal was a bit longer than Power Rangers, I think it was honestly a bit easier, as the game gives you plenty of lives, and plenty of chances to get more as well. Also, with different playable characters and different routes to explore, there's definitely some replay value to be experienced here, which I think makes this an ideal Super 16 challenge, where it gives you a taste of what to expect, but a thirst to experience more on your own time when the event is over, whether you want to play it as a speed game or even just casually like me, and that's a pretty cool feature. Overall, a great way to conclude the third quartile of this year's Super 16 event. For game number 13, we are heading back once again into Capcom territory with another SNES claim to fame for them, in the form of their licensed Disney games. Because we have the third installment of the Magical Quest series, Magical Quest 3, starring Mickey and Donald. The first game was covered all the way back in Super 16 number 3, and the second game, Great Circus Mystery, was featured in event number 5, the second event I took part in. So it feels pretty nice to be able to wrap up this mini-series. This is especially true considering that this particular game wasn't actually even released in America, at least on this console, since it did come out on the Game Boy Advance when the entire trilogy released on that. Although we were allowed to use the English translation patch of this particular game for this challenge. Anyway, the goal for this game is to beat Stage 4, so let's get into it. The Magical Quest is a platformer series through and through, and although I wouldn't say it's a very difficult platformer, it tries to spice up its gameplay through the use of various costumes in suit for Mickey and Donald, which will give our protagonists some unique abilities and fighting skills. While some uses will exclusively be focused on combat-oriented gameplay, some of these will be required to get through individual levels, so if you get stuck somewhere, try to use a different form to see if you can make progress with that in some way. World 1 is, as you might expect, a walk in the park. Even the mid-boss is as easy as throwing 3 blocks at a turkey, and I wish I was joking, but no, that's pretty much what the fight is. After taking down the Thanksgiving MVP, we get our first costume in the form of the Wooden Knight, and this is pretty much your combat form. It packs a punch, literally, and doesn't require any additional ammo to use, although it does have a meter, and if you wait for the meter to charge, I believe it puts up some extra damage, so keep that in mind. Although there are moments where consistent fast attacks are very important as well, much like the case of the first boss, where you can juggle it fairly easy as it bounces around in its underwear. Again, I'm not joking when I'm saying that. Stage 2 immediately introduces us to our second costume in the form of climbing gear, I think? I don't really know what to refer to this as, but it allows you to climb vines and slide down zipline cables. It's pretty neat, but very situational, and in the case of this challenge, it's really only used in this world anyway. The climbing is kinda awkward as well, as it feels pretty slow, although you can get a pretty nifty horizontal jump if you switch sides on the vine, and then jump off in that direction, which can be used for speed purposes. The bosses in this area are also interesting, starting with a moth that you have to fight on a side-scrolling arena with a bunch of vines. The important thing to remember about this boss, though, is that in addition to jumping on its head, you can also do damage by switching sides on the vine, so if it gets too close to you, try swapping sides to do an extra hit of damage. The second boss is a giant flower, which, while also being incredibly intimidating, has a real complex strategy for how you take it down. See how brutal that was? Stage 3 takes place in a mountainous desert area, and after using the Wooden Knight to take down a really annoying skeleton boss, you get the third and final costume in the form of a magician. This costume really reminds me of the magical turban from the first game, but this costume has more gimmicky features, being able to turn enemies and impediments into other things that may help you progress in the game. It can also turn boss projectiles into a means of pushing their own offenses against them, which is definitely the case of the stage's boss as well, turning this giant worm's rocks into weights that will crush it against your cunning. Stage 4 starts with an auto-scroller as you climb a bunch of floating blocks and ride balloon platforms into a flying pirate ship. This stage's most defining feature, though, at least in my opinion, is the absolute banger of a song that plays during this ascent. Seriously, the sound team was cooking with this one. The bosses of this area can be a little complicated, though. Much like the worm boss, you want to use the magical form so you can send the first boss's cannonballs back at him, and when you get to the second boss, you should bring the knight out of retirement in order to take out the rambunctious pirate. These bosses can be a little awkward to fight, and the timing of their attacks and hitboxes may throw you off a bit, especially in the second fight where the arena literally tilts around. But I wouldn't say they are anything too extreme. This is the Magical Quest after all, not Dark Souls. But yeah, after the pirate goes down, that's this challenge completed, and another game is taken down. I will always have very positive thoughts and feelings about the Magical Quest series, going back to the many times I rented the first game at my local video store when I was a kid. And although that experience was exclusively with just the first game, I've had plenty of fun with it during my adventures through the game later on in life as well, and after playing the second game, it gave me some pretty nice impressions too. For the third game, I'll admittedly say that while it is probably my least favorite of the trilogy, it still intrigued me enough and still offered the same level of fun and excitement that I've come to expect and enjoy from the series as a whole. I just found the newer costumes a little more tricky to master and optimize, and some of the bosses were a little more awkward to deal with, and the variability of their difficulty was a little all over the place. That's actually what made getting a good time for this game actually a bit difficult, because so many of the bosses could be stun locked, and although some were easy to pull off, I had trouble with others, namely the skeleton boss in 3-1 and the pirate boss in 4-4, where if you don't get the stun lock hit exactly, you could be spending a bit more time trying to take the boss down. You can also choose between Mickey and Donald as your playable character, and although there are slight differences in their playstyles and hitboxes, I wouldn't say there was too much of a difference between them overall. I decided to just stick with Mickey though, because pretty much I'd gotten used to him at that point. Another interesting feature of this game is that whenever you take a death, assuming you still have extra lives anyway, you respawn in a balloon in the sky that releases your character when you pop out. It is time consuming to take a death, no question, but in some levels you can actually use this to your benefit, as you have a little control over the balloon and can move it up to a higher land, and land on a higher platform, skipping some platforming elements in the process. I didn't utilize this feature too much, as I'm not one to intentionally waste lives, particularly in cases where I feel like I might need them, but thankfully though, even if you do get a game over, you have infinite continues, and you only start at the beginning of the level or screen you started on, so it's not too much of a penalty if you do take that much of a beating. But yeah, that's about it for the Magical Quest 3. Definitely one of the better goals, at least for me in this particular Super 16 event. But let's get a move on to the last 3 games, and let me just say, the organizers were really onto something when it came to how this year closed. Be prepared to see why in just a moment. Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Conquest, developed by Rareware and published by Nintendo. I had a feeling we'd be seeing this game this year. Heck, I had a feeling we'd be seeing Mega Man 7 as well, and even had a hunch about Kirby's Avalanche and another game we'll see later. But when you think about 1995, how could you not think about DKC 2? I'm not going to beat around the bush here. Of all the games featured on this list, this is probably the game that ranks highest for me. In fact, it was the game that ranked highest for me in my top 15 list a few years ago. Again, the games in this list, not overall. So, it's no secret that I was excited about this one. What's the goal for this one, you ask? Well, in theory, we have quite the lengthy completion requirement here, assuming you play this casually anyway. But for this goal, we have to make it all the way through World 3 of the game and defeat the third boss, Cudgel. That's quite a bit of content we're going through here, most notably 16 levels and 3 boss fights. However, if you know your DKC2, this is not as long as you think it is, and I will very quickly explain why. You see, the first 2 worlds of the game, Gangplank Galleon and Crocodile Cauldron, actually have a warp in every single level of these 2 worlds. Find this warp, usually in the first 3% of the level, and you will warp to the very end, leading to a very quick level completion. Yeah, we're not going for all the bonuses here, we just need to complete the level. So completing the first 2 worlds is actually very quick, and not even half the gameplay in this challenge, assuming you use the warps anyway. The bosses themselves are also pretty easy as well. Crow only needs 4 eggs to be beaten, and Cleaver, although intimidating for a newcomer, has a pretty obvious pattern to follow. After taking down the first 2 worlds, we have Krim Key, an area that we can't exactly skip as easily as the prior 2, so we're going to need to play all these levels in full. Kinda. There are still some skips, which I'll point out when we get to those levels, but it's easily 500% more gameplay, rough estimate, than anything we've had to do before. Barrel Bayou is a very quick stage, even considering the fact that you have to use rotating barrel cannons to move through some sections of the level. Hey, at least you can control the direction in a huge majority of these cases. Glimmer's Galleon is also not that bad of a level either. Honestly, the biggest annoyance is not even the fact that it's a water level, but more so the flashes of light that keep trying to blind the player and anyone watching whenever you change direction. Seriously, a very questionable design choice, I must say. Crockhead Clamber is a level I actually really enjoy moving fast in, and probably my favorite level in the game from the first 3 worlds. It just feels so rewarding to move fast, and with Dixie's helicopter spin, it's a thrill discovering so many sections you can kind of just skip over with a nice hair float. Rattle Battle could be a difficult level for folks because it's the first level without warping where your playable character will drastically change, since you need to play as Rattly the Rattlesnake, who doesn't have as much movement and momentum, but has a jump that could easily rival and overtake the Mario Brothers. It's still a fun level to play through, just probably one of the harder ones to move fast in. Probably the slowest level of this challenge though is Slime Climb, a level that you have to climb vertically while also staying ahead of a vicious fish that haunts the waters below. It's a level where you have to be fast, but patient, as there's numerous obstacles and enemies along the way that you'll need to get through, but since you have that sense of urgency, you'll be very tempted to move fast, maybe even too fast for your own good. Thankfully though, there are some nice skips that can be used here to make this level really fast, and I'll talk about those later. The final normal level we have is Bramble Blast, and yep, Sticker Brush Symphony is here. So get those jam and sour please emotes in chat. I would say that this is the best song in DKC2, but let's be real, 95% of the soundtrack is the best song in DKC2. It's just that good of an OST. Bless you, David Wise. This level can be kinda slow as there's a lot of barrel cannons you have to shoot through, and some of them can feel like absolute mazes as well, so memorization of the right path can definitely help you here. There's also apparently a skip that can allow you to skip the biggest maze of them all, but I admittedly did not know how to do it, so I just did it as intended. Finally, after overcoming the thorns, we reach Cudgel, where all we have to do is avoid his jumps and ground-shaking maneuvers and throw a couple of TNT barrels at him until he goes down in 6 hits, and completing this challenge as a result just before we reach the amusement park world as a matter of fact. Yeah, sorry Diddy and Dixie, that fun and excitement will have to wait for another day. Overall, this challenge was great, and I think it was honestly the perfect length too. 3 worlds may seem like a lot, but since you're skipping 2 entire worlds at the very beginning if you use the warps, I feel like a 2-world goal would have been too short, and going up to 4 would have been, I think, stretching it a bit, since World 4 does have some pretty long gauntlets and even a few auto-scrollers as well. I think in leaving it at 3, you get a nice mix of everything, and although the speed tech is vital for getting a good time, I think it's just as fun to play through the game as fast naturally too, so it's a game very approachable for both the casual and speedrun crowd as a result. Speaking of the speed tech, there are a few levels I mentioned having glitches or tricks for getting through a lot faster. Level 1-2, Main Brace Mayhem, is actually one of those cases. Even though it has a level warp, you can use a very nifty trick that can send you into a barrel wrong warp and have you skip straight back to the map screen with the level already completed. However, getting this trick just right was really hard for me to pull off. I did it in practice a few times, but getting it consistently just wasn't in the cards for me. Crockhead Clamber also had something like this, but I found it just as hard to pull off as well. It really depends on how quick you can manage the maneuver, as well as exact positioning, neither of which are my strong suits. Slime Climb actually has 2 skips, and the first one is actually fairly easy to pull off. If you manage to switch Kongs to Diddy while Dixie is in the water, you actually can store a super jump, where if Diddy gets hit by an enemy, Dixie will fly up super high, skipping a decent amount of the level and actually bypassing the trigger for the water to raise, giving you more time to act against Snapjaw in the water. You can also follow up this tech with another wrong warp, but much like the other 2 uses of this, timing and positioning are important, as you need to throw the invisible bug just before you hit a bonus barrel. Do it wrong though, and you'll just go to the bonus area anyway, and when you come out of it, the water will be back to normal and right on your tail, so keep that in mind. I wish I could have learned to do these techniques more consistently, but when the drawback of not getting these moves is just plain more DKC2 as a result, well, I'll be honest, that's not really much of a drawback. I absolutely love this game, and I'm very happy it was included for a Super 16 event. This also means that Donkey Kong Country 3 will likely be in a future event as well. Probably not next year, but trust me, I would not be surprised to see this series back 2 years from now to put a close to this legendary trilogy. Okay, RPG lovers, it's time to knock out another big-time SNES RPG. So let's get on our time travel shoes and jaunt our way into Chrono Trigger, developed and published by Square. Seriously, this game does not need any introduction. It's definitely one of, if not the most beloved RPG on the console, and trust me, there's already a lot to love from this genre on this system to begin with. Also, Super 16 has to have an RPG game somewhere on each list, so I guess it was just Chrono Trigger's turn this year. The goal for this run is to beat the very first boss of the game, named Yakra, which takes place in Manolia Cathedral, which really isn't too far into the game. Now, because of the nature of this game's plot, I don't really want to spoil too much, but since this is the beginning of the game and you don't get into too many plot elements anyway, you should be fine to listen here. But wanted to give that warning out there anyway, that if you really want to experience this game for yourself, do yourself a favor and let that happen, and don't let me do any of that for you. But here are the basic events that must happen to complete this goal. Head to the Millennial Fair as Chrono, where after wandering around for a bit, you quite literally bump into a girl named Marl, who drops her pendant. After retrieving it for her, she follows you around for a bit, and you meet your friend Luca, who is performing an invention showcase with her father, a teleporting pod that warps any person from point A to point B. Pretty cool, eh? Well, Marl thinks it's cool too, so she jumps in and tests it out herself, but her pendant starts to react to the technology and causes her to disappear, leaving her pendant behind. Chrono decides to try the invention himself, using the pendant as a way to follow Marl to her unknown destination. Chrono makes his way around this new world when he stumbles across Castle Guardia, and inside, he actually meets a girl who remarkably looks a lot like Marl, but is actually the queen of the palace. Plot twist! The girl is actually Marl herself, and when she tries to explain to Chrono that everyone thinks she's Queen Lean, the true royalty of this place, Marl once again vanishes in a strange light. As Chrono leaves the palace, he runs into Luca, who confirms a few things to Chrono. 1, they are in the past, and 2, Marl is actually a distant relative of the queen of this time period, which means her disappearance could mean that something bad is currently happening to the real queen. Chrono and Luca make their way to a nearby cathedral, where they find some rather spooky and suspicious stuff going on. After they fight a few of the villains, a noble frog warrior named Frog comes along and saves Luca and Chrono from getting overwhelmed, joining their party for the time being. They continue fighting through the cathedral, where they run into the real Queen Lean and her captor Yakra, causing the trio to fight him off and save their queen for real, saving Marl and perhaps more importantly, the space-time continuum. And that's pretty much the end of the challenge. Now, here's the general struggle with speedrunning or speeding through an RPG title like this. 1, you are meant, or at the very least expected, to do a bunch of fights along your adventure to gain valuable fighting experience to get stronger, and to a lesser but still important aspect, items and resources to keep yourself alive. However, since we are trying to go fast, we need to do as little fighting as possible and collect as little as possible so we can simply just complete our goal. Some fighting is still recommended though. In fact, some fights will actually be required too, so we'll at least get some experience. But it is important to realize that at the core, we are a lot more squishy and less powerful than we would probably be in a more casual playthrough otherwise. Getting Chrono and Luca's first battle techs are very important. Not only do these techs, and especially their dual tech, do a lot of damage, but they can actually finish some of the required fights a bit more quickly as well. So try to obtain that before heading into the cathedral. Frog is a little less important in that regard, but getting him some extra experience to learn his healing move Slurp is not a terrible idea, as having a heal during the boss could be a good lifesaver, and saved me a couple of times, that's for sure. You also want to make sure you grab a few items along the way. Any chest that has a tonic or revive could be a must-get, and I personally really appreciated getting the ether in Queen Lean's room, just so I could restock on some of my MP during my run, since I was kinda going out of my way to do a few more fights anyway. Also, any equipment or accessories could be vital as well, especially for Chrono since he will be a main fighting force of this run. Also, don't forget, you can get a second sword for both Chrono and Frog along the way as well. It's not a huge increase of offense for both characters, but could come in handy in a pinch. I also picked up 2 powered tabs along the way, and gave them both to Chrono as well, just to keep him strong and keep dealing out the damage. Yakra is easily the most dangerous fight, and part of this run. It's a 3 versus 1 in your favor, but he can really deal out the heavy damage if you aren't careful. In fact, during the early stages of the fight when you have all 3 characters alive, he can pretty much counterattack every single attack that lands on him, some of which can hit all 3 party members in the process. Apparently he is much less strict if one of your party members is gone though, so maybe consider going into the fight with a damaged Lucca or something, and keep using Chrono and Frog to punish the beast as much as possible once Lucca finally goes down. And if one of your team members gets low on health, use a tonic or slurp to keep them alive, but only if you think he can knock them out. It's a tough fight, but definitely feels rewarding when you see those victory screen flashes. But yeah, that's pretty much the challenge for this game, and honestly, this is probably the best RPG challenge for Super 16 that I've personally experienced so far. It's not that long, you don't have to sit through too much dialogue. Heck, I still stand by the Mega Man 7 dialogue being slightly more irritating than this, and I think it gives a pretty good demo of what to expect from this game without covering too much, allowing those who are foreign to it a chance to get a taste of what magic you can experience here, and maybe encouraged to check out more of the game on their own time. Also, even though the boss can be a bit challenging on a low level run, if you want to be safe, it's not too unreasonable to grind levels out either. Heck, even Chrono and Frog together have a pretty strong dual tech you can try to unlock beforehand, although you will be likely doing way more than necessary if you go that far. Still though, it's nice to have options if you aren't that confident. So yeah, really good challenge here, and one that is very worthy of Chrono Trigger's legacy. Okay folks, we are finally here for the last game of this year's Super 16. And after the nightmare of Dracula X from last year, I got a really huge break this time because we're heading down to a lovely little place I like to call Yoshi's Island, also known as Super Mario World 2, developed and published by Nintendo, of course. I think it's no secret that I love this game, from my various playthroughs I've done, both Let's Play and through streams, and the fact that I even actually learned to speedrun this game a little bit for Stack Game Marathon a few years ago. It's just a game that has always resonated with me, and even though it has some notoriety with 100% completionists, for me, it's never really bothered me that much. Given it's a game from my childhood, and much like the last 2 games, also clocks into my top 15 SNES list, but I don't know, I just always get a euphoric joy from playing this game, and I'm happy that it's here for a Super 16 list, and for the finale of a list as well. However, the one thing I will critique this challenge for, and it's really the only negative, and a negative that's really only exclusive for this challenge in particular, I kinda wish the goal was longer. Our goal this time is just to play through the first world, and yes, I get it, the first world can be quite lengthy, averaging around a 15-minute completion time, but still, I honestly don't think adding World 2, or maybe even just half of World 2, would have been that bad. It is the finale after all, and usually the finale has been an any % game completion goal of some kind, and although that would have been preposterous expecting that for a beast of a game like this, I don't know, it just seems kinda weird that 6 other challenges were still somehow slower for me than this one. However, I digress. Some Yoshi's Island is always better than no Yoshi's Island, so I'll take my victories when and where I can. The challenge for this is really not that bad, even if you don't decide to go for any of the heavy speedrun skips. It's just 8 levels to get through, most of them are pretty straightforward, and aside from making sure that you have plenty of eggs along with you, the strats here are really just to run and jump and flutter when you need to, and shoot eggs when you need to. First and foremost, once you start the tutorial stage, do yourself a favor and press start and select. This skips the training and takes you directly to the world map where you can start 1-1. Pretty nifty, eh? 1-1 is pretty simple, just run straight to the right and jump over or bounce on enemies along the way. You can actually do a pretty neat skip if you place an enemy at the right point, bounce on it to get a boost, and carry a flutter all the way to the top of the section, skipping a part where you need to fire an egg at a cloud to get a beanstalk to appear. After that part though, it's a short jog to the end, and pretty much the end of the first level. 1-2 also has a very neat skip as well, but I'll say it right now, I cannot do it consistently. It involves bouncing off of a mid-air enemy so you can flutter over the top of the level, and it allows you to skip the one and only sub-area in this level, getting you to the end almost immediately. It's pretty cool, but again, really hard to pull off. Thankfully though, the sub-area isn't too long, but you will probably be wasting about a minute of time if you don't get this skip. Fun fact, if you do take this area, you actually don't need to use the helicopter transformation, so you could potentially cut out some time off with that anyway. 1-3 is pretty quick and free, at least for me anyway. Just another case of moving right and following the path until there's no more path to follow. And 1-4 is pretty much the same as well. Although, don't forget you need to grab the key to open a door in 1-4, although it's only a small bit to the right of the door anyway. Bashful Bird is also a pretty simple mini-boss to take down as well. Just fire an egg whenever he's vulnerable and proceed to take off those pants. Oh, speaking of which, I better hide his shame, otherwise I might get YouTube demonetized. 1-5 is an auto-scroller, so have fun waiting. 1-6 is another cave level hybrid, and I wouldn't say it's that tough either. Although, be careful of the mushroom room, as I discovered that if you jump against those one-side entry flippers, it'll actually eat your ability to use the flutter jump, which actually screwed me over in a practice run, and my actual live run for the event, which was definitely not fun having a time loss like that. 1-7 is the famous Touch Fuzzy, Get Dizzy. And, well, I touched Fuzzy and got dizzy. Not much to say there. Real talk though, this is actually a pretty short level, so not much to say beyond the fuzzy high. And finally, 1-8, the final level of this challenge, is another pretty straightforward castle. In the room with the spike platform buttons, you can actually hit the red switch early and get a faster path to the key, allowing you to simply jump up and go to the door without needing to go around the whole area again. As for the Salvo the Slime battle, this can actually be a pretty tricky fight to do fast, just because of how unpredictable his moves can be. He may jump in a way you aren't expecting, he may drop a lemon drop at a bad time, or he might shake himself in place, which causes any eggs that hit him to be null and forfeit. But if you stay persistent and fire some good angles, he'll be gone in no time, completing World 1, this challenge, and of course, the entire Super 16 event as a whole. Again, I don't have much to say here other than the fact that this game is amazing, and I really wish the challenge was longer. That's really about it. Yoshi's Island will always be one of my favorite games, and whenever I play it, it always seems to lead me to wanting more from it. Heck, that's probably why I usually go for 100% whenever I do play it, because it allows me more time to soak up everything I love about this game that is near and dear to my heart, and that is not just something that's ever going to change with it. Well, there we have it, folks. The entire Super 16 list is completely done and over with now. Final thoughts? It was pretty damn good. Honestly, with the exception of the mask, there really wasn't a game I hated here. Some games were awkward, some games featured a genre I'm not crazy about, and some had some instances where RNG could end up being quite nasty to you. But I never really felt stuck on any of those games. Mask was really the only game I went into not really knowing how a run was going to turn out until the very end, and had enough instances during the run where a single thing going wrong could really make me lose my cool, and that was always a hard pill for me to swallow. Beyond that though, I really loved and vibed with this list, and I think it really helped for the following two reasons. For one, as I discussed earlier, I had played pretty much a majority of these games already, so I didn't really need as much practice to begin with, as opposed to last year when I literally only played one of the 16 games to start. And two, the organizers really listened to the feedback from last year and significantly decreased the goal length in a way where I feel like the games were way more approachable this time. Heck, if anything, the only goal that felt off was Yoshi's Island, and that's purely just because I personally wanted to play more of it. So I have to give the organizers props here for really making this list accessible for people and the players without having to donate so much time for the event overall. As far as my own personal ranking or tier list for this event, this is how everything is stacked up. Keep in mind, this list is just for how I saw and felt about the challenges for the Super 16, and not the games themselves, although it admittedly kind of fell into that way regardless. DKC2, Yoshi's Island, and Chrono Trigger were the top ones, but I also really enjoyed Phantom, The Magical Quest 3, Kirby's Avalanche, Final Fight 3, Doom, and Mega Man 7 as well. Power Rangers and Battle Racers were fine, didn't really feel super strongly about those games one way or the other, and I kind of put Bomberman 3 in this category too, just because while I liked the game, the RNG involved with the run could make it feel like such a slog at times. Super Turrican 2 was the absolute definition of aggressively okay. Toy Story had its moments, but felt kind of punishing to play at times, and I don't think I need to repeat myself in regards to my feelings on fighting games for Killer Instinct. And of course, I think we know what title gets the bottom here. Sorry, Jim Carrey. No disrespect, I promise. Now, let's talk about my performance on race day. To preface this, though, I should mention that my training regimen changed a little this year. For the most part, I did about the same thing. I did a dry run of all the challenges just to get a feel for the games and find out what my trouble spots could end up being, and then just practice on what I thought I needed to practice on until I eventually got my times to about where I wanted them to be before the event, and then I just grinded them out until I was ready for the big day. The differences, though, were that I didn't live stream my practices this time, rather just played them on my own Discord server through screen share, and of course did some practice on my own time if I felt like it. Also, in the week leading up to the event, I also did a full live run of the event, or at least split it up across 2 days, just so I was ready for the marathon aspect of switching between games and playing a bunch of these challenges back to back. Overall, I think this honestly helped me a lot. It's hard to say for complete certainty, because as I elaborated earlier, this list was indisputably easier than past events, but I think in general it settled a lot of my nerves come race day, and even during my practices I felt the pressure was lowered tremendously as well, since I wasn't live on stream. Anyway, if you took my best times from each of the games before the live event, I ended up with an overall personal best of 3 hours and 46 minutes. A really respectable time, considering the fact that I don't even know if I ever managed an overall time under 5 hours in prior events. Certainly not on race day, anyway. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that during the event, it is required to have a 45-second wait in between games, and a 2-minute wait at the halfway point, just to give the other racers who might be using actual hardware instead of emulation time to switch games and swap cartridges. So with that time added in, my overall PB time was more of a 3:58. Now, did I expect to get or beat this time during race day, or hell even get a sub 4? Definitely not. These were all of my best runs, and even just getting one PB would have been a massive accomplishment, so realistically, my goal for this event was just to get under 4 hours and 30 minutes. And let me tell you, with a time of 4 hours and 5 minutes, including PBs in Kirby's Avalanche, The Mask, Magical Quest 3, and Donkey Kong Country 2, I absolutely crushed it. Just the fact that I came within striking distance of sub 4 was pretty freaking incredible, and I was really proud of my performance overall. Yeah, I was still 7 minutes short of my overall PB time, but if I had practiced The Mask a bit more, or if the RNG was a bit better in Bomberman 3, I didn't have such a close call in Chrono Trigger, or if I didn't mess up some of my Yoshi's Island movements, I really think I could have done sub 4. But hey, beggars can't be choosers, and I'll take being within 10 minutes of my optimal goal, while also crushing my realistic goal. Hell, because I played so well, I actually managed to get an interview during the actual race broadcast after I was done, and managed to stick around for the rest of the broadcast to commentate, which was a really fun experience as well. As far as the Super 16 leaderboard is concerned, I ended up taking 6th place, probably the highest placement I've ever had in one of these events. Given the event was missing some other notable names and front-runners, as some of them couldn't find the time to participate this year, still, it felt nice to actually be 80% through the list before the first and second player hit the .done button. I gotta admit, it felt kinda nice being able to hang with the big kids for once. In fact, according to stats that were provided after the event, my Kirby's Avalanche time actually ended up being the 3rd best time on race day, the first time I've ever earned an accolade of that degree in one of these races before. Which, hey, a 50-second PB on race day for a relatively short goal with lots of RNG involved, not too shabby. Not too shabby at all. So yeah, that's another Super 16 event in the books, and as I've made very clear at this point, I really enjoyed this list, and I eagerly await next year's list with very watchful eyes. This was a great selection of games, with very reasonable and appropriate goals, and although there were a few trouble spots here and there, I honestly believe The Mask was easily the worst part of this event, and nothing will get me off of that hill. But hey, not all SNES games could be winners, I guess, and if there had to be some low quality games on here, I'm happy it was just that one. And with that, let's wrap this up before this gets any longer. As usual, I want to thank the organizers of this event for putting it on for an 8th year in a row, so major kudos to the Speed Gaming crew, and most notably users Feasel and Joig Ariel, sorry if I mispronounced that by the way, for not only putting on the event, but also doing the incredibly tricky task of making the game and goal selections. I'm sure that's not easy to come up with. Of course, also major shoutouts to the rest of the Super 16 participants for making it through another year of doing this. Special mention and thanks to Zockerstu, whose practice stream VOD I studied quite a bit in preparation for this marathon. Ryo, who I actually clocked in very similar times with, in both practice and the actual event, and being kind of a rival of sorts. And even though she didn't race this year, user Fee for being one of the broadcast commentators for the event. It was fun being in the booth with her after the race and hearing her insight as someone who at least attempted practicing the list and had a lot of great knowledge about the games involved. Hoping to see you in the race another time. Also, another special shout out to the blind runners at the bottom of the placement list, those who did not practice for the list at all and attempted the challenges for the first time on the actual race day. I say it every year, but it takes tremendous dedication, determination, and fortitude to do all of this for the first time, especially when there are a bunch of people watching live. And even though this list was easier than past years, it still had the mask, and honestly, even games like Phantom, Doom, and Toy Story could be difficult to navigate if you didn't know what you were doing. So these rock stars definitely deserve the credit and kudos here. And finally, I want to thank all of my viewers during the live event, as well as all of those who hung out with me during my various Discord screen share practices as well. Most notably Magnus8M, Master Starman, Odin-Spack, Silverstar65, ELD18, Anthony Blaylock, Cirque Redrum, and Mike. Having people to talk to during my practices was nice, and I really appreciated the company. But yeah, I think that's going to do it for this recap, so thank you all for listening, and I look forward to seeing what the future of the Super 16 will bring for the year 2025. As for general game predictions, I'm thinking we might see some Kirby Superstar next year, and maybe some Earthbound for next year's RPG title, and perhaps an appearance of the final Mega Man X game as well with X3. Also, calling it now, I think Tetris Attack will be the puzzle game. I think it makes sense since that's like the only big puzzle game remaining from our list currently, and it's kind of timely considering we just did Yoshi's Island for this year's event. But we'll see what happens. Also, if you want to see my full run of the Super 16 this year, I will include a link to that in the video description, as well as my recap video from last year, and a playlist that contains every Super 16 run I've done so far, if you want to see what the other events were like. This has been Slim Kirby, thanks again for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys next time. Later, folks.
Bronto Burt!